of course, you can get into other topics, more hotly debated topics, right? Like the priesthood, the extension of the priesthood to the blacks. And if you ask me, I don't know, right? That's one of those where I do not know why it took that long. I don't know, honestly. And there's a great paper that was written. I'll send it to you if you've never seen it, by
Appreciate
the son of Spencer W. Kimball. And or sorry, was it son? I think it was a son. Yeah, son or brother. I think it was a son actually. And it's available through BYU. It's a really well written document where there's all the detail there that you most people don't know about what happened, how we got to that point, and then how we got to 1977, where the priesthood was finally extended to all worthy males. And it's absolutely enlightening. It's absolutely unbelievable. But it also taught me one thing as I read through that document, and I'll share it with you. Number one is that sometimes the Lord lets us dictate the path on our own. He doesn't always tell us where we need to go, but that means we might go the wrong way,
yeah.
right? And then he'll correct us and he'll bring us back, right? And I think a lot of things happened, right, at that time, from the time of the Restoration to the 70s. And decisions were made by men, natural men, humans who don't have perfect knowledge of everything. And they did what they could. And there were social influences, cultural influences that affected everything. But yeah, were there mistakes made? Probably. This document certainly adds a lot of light to that. And it's really quite interesting, the experiences of Spencer W. Kimball, David O. McKay, and other presidents who struggled with it from early on. This isn't something that just became the topic in 1975, 76. It was there for many, many decades, right? So it really gave me a really good understanding, appreciation for how difficult of a decision that was, right? And again, why didn't the Lord just reveal this to Joseph Smith from day one? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I know my brother and others have raised this, which is a very valid point, that when the church was restored in 1830, think about what the country was like back at that day, right? Think about the South. Think about the difference between the South and the North. And the church was already under a lot of stress, being very different, right? Of course, they had difficulties moving into Ohio, later much more into Missouri. So add another level of of grace, and I don't know, maybe it would have made things almost impossible for the church at that time. I don't know, and that's just a theory, right, by men. One day, I guess we'll know for sure why the Lord decided and waited until 1977. But there's also some stories in that book, or in that chapter, of some very valiant members of the church, males in particular, black males, who stuck it out and were members of the church. And I cannot even imagine the faith that those men had to have to be members of a church where they were not able to hold the priesthood. Because if you said that to me, I would probably be the first one out the door, right? I'd say, well, this isn't fair. I'm out of here then, right? And yet there's so many men who stuck it out, right? They were faithful.
And
They didn't,
they're not what would you say, people that we use as symbolic.
right?
We look at these as great men, as
Mhm.
being better than most of us in their conviction to the
Yeah,
gospel.
yeah. And they wouldn't have known any more than we have, right? Like nobody knew. It's not like all of a sudden, because I've heard their testimonies and of some of them, and they didn't know either, right? They didn't know. That didn't make sense to them. It's not like they got a revelation that, okay, everything's going to be okay. Don't worry about it. You'll get the priesthood. They weren't sure if it was even going to happen in their lifetime. And
Right,
in fact,
right.
I heard a gentleman the other day on a YouTube channel, and he was giving his testimony, and he said, I was convinced, based on something that I think Elder Bruce R. McConkie had said, that I wouldn't get the priesthood until the
I
millennium.
think I just watched that one. It was
Yeah,
he would talk about he was joined in 1972,
yeah, right.
and he went with the BYU.
Hmm. Yeah, the
He said,
ambassadors,
"I can't
BYU
be a
ambassadors.
missionary because he
That's
wrote
right.
the prophet
Because he didn't have the
twice."
priesthood. Well, he didn't have
He
the
says,
priesthood.
"I can't go
Yeah,
on a mission, but yet the women could go on a mission." And
right. And the
he
young
said,
ambassadors.
"Well, they can get endowed." And he says, "Well,
Yeah,
fine." But then he joins the
the young
BYU,
ambassadors, BYU
yeah,
young
young
ambassadors.
ambassadors, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, no, that kind of faith is unbelievable to me.
yeah,
Like that,
absolutely.
I feel this big when I hear those stories because
Mhm.
I've had it easy compared to them, right?
Yeah,
And that gentleman was ready to live the rest of his life thinking that he was not going to have the priesthood until the millennium.
yeah.
And he had accepted it, and he probably figured one day I'll understand. But he had a testimony, and you can't deny that, right? He did end up with a testimony aside from the fact that he couldn't hold the priesthood. It's an amazing story to me, seriously.
Because again, my relatives are Elijah Abel. I
Mhm.
have on my mom's side, I have plenty of black relatives today from marriages, uh, and then I have my dad's side. There was my great grandfather. He married a black woman, had or was having children by a black woman.
Mhm.
So I have plenty of reason to, in my heart, that idea of them being withheld doesn't sit well with me.
No, no, right,
It
yeah.
never does. It's
Mm.
hard to uh, to to ex, to come to grips with that, but because of the foundation of the church being true
Yeah,
and all that it stands for, and the fact it was from God that the church was restored, I just say in time,
yeah.
I will. There might not be any answer that anybody could ever give that would ever convict them. Even God can't give them the answer.
Yeah, but
because
I think
because
your
it
point,
doesn't no matter what we say or God says to them, it's uninviting.
yeah, and I think your point is really really good there, right? That it just didn't sit well, and it doesn't sit well with a lot of people to this day. When that topic comes up for discussion, obviously when you study the Doctrine and Covenants, you're going to get to it because the Doctrine and Covenants includes Declaration 1 and 2, and actually those are the two hottest topics in the church probably when it comes to why and why did this happen and why did it stop and everything, right? So you can't ignore them. You have to cover, as a gospel doctrine teacher, you have to cover Declaration 1 and 2,
Yeah,
right? You can skip over it, I guess, if you want, pretend it's not there, but reality is it's there. And if you're going to cover it, the questions are going to come up. And it's difficult. It doesn't sit well with you, yeah, as an individual, right? And I haven't had to go through it, but unfortunately, but for me too, it doesn't sit well. And I hope one day I can understand it better, but yeah, I'll send you the document and maybe we could chat about it at
oh
another
yeah,
day
absolutely.
because there's some amazing insights in that paper that was really well written. It's funny. There's a story in there about once it was close to being announced, uh, President Monson, although he was Elder Monson at the time, he's
Yeah,
still in the 12th. He went and had lunch. I think it was with the editor of the Deseret News, and he said to him, "I need you to hold the front page for Wednesday or something like this, right?" And he said, "Why? Is it a big story or something? Can you tell me anything?" Right? And he said, "No, I can't tell you anything, but you'll know when you see it. When you'll see it, right?" And sure enough, it was announced, and of course they were holding space in the front page. Almost like the end of the war, World War II, that kind of an announcement that
yeah, yeah,
goes big across the front of the newspaper. Yeah.
yeah. There's again, there's we and reading the Book of Mormon, that the black skin comes up and
Yeah.
things like that. And
Yeah.
and I just had a discussion with another friend of mine who's an anti, just hates that
Hmm.
idea.
Yeah.
But we we have to understand that Lord deals with us based on what He thinks is best for us.
Hmm.
It's not because He's trying to uh, 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 tear us down in the way to completely destroy us, but He's trying to tear us down to a point where we can be built back up to the right. And that idea
Yeah.
that may and I had this idea, and I think it's works in some ways, but it's not the mind of the Lord, it's the mind of AJ. Okay.
Sure. Hmm.
It's he he allows this thing about the priesthood and the blacks and all these other things that go, the nuances go on with that to a point so that we as members today are intolerant of that attitude.
Hmm.
We've we would never look at our brothers and sisters in Africa or anywhere else that have a darker skin than we, and look at them for me or for you. It
Sure. Yeah.
seems like, and I don't want to judge anybody or make this like a broad brush across everybody. But I think mostly the people in the church don't look at, we don't discriminate because we don't want, because we are in, we feel that wrath always of
Sure.
being the church, of segregation within the priesthood.
Yeah. And I mean, the church now is global, right? Like it's all over the place. The face of the church is very different, right, from what it was back in the 50s and 60s, where it was basically white men and white women with blonde hair often, that was kind of the face of the church. The face of the church now is, it's all over the place, right? It's blacks. There's a lot of members in the church in Africa now. Parts of African countries like Ghana are just growing like crazy.
Yeah.
Philippines, huge, one of the largest, the most spoken languages in the church outside of English is languages spoken in Philippines. So yeah, it's, the church is certainly global now. And which is the way it should be, right? Because
Right.
we are all sons and daughters of the same God who created us very differently and allowed us to evolve over time because of just the way humans mix differently, right? And but yeah, I think it's a beautiful thing now. But yeah, one of those things that's kind of often difficult to understand. I'll tell you one thing that helped me understand it. And definitely, this document is very helpful. But one thing that helped me at a more less academic uh, way is last year's study of the Old Testament. And you have to go back to basically the very beginning, right, with Adam and Eve and Abel and
Who's
Cain.
cursed?
Exactly, yeah. Because people get that whole curse thing completely wrong, right? They believe that the curse is the skin color. That wasn't the curse. If you go back and you study that part of the Old Testament, it's very clear. And fortunately, the Pearl of Great Price adds a little bit of insights there. But the curse was that because he killed his brother, he basically gave up the rights to the priesthood and any blessings that came through the priesthood that he would have been entitled to hold. Right. The reason the color of the skin was put on Cain was because you'll recall that he said, well, I won't be able to go anywhere now. People will know that I killed my brother and they'll come after me and this and that. And so the Lord changed the color of his skin to actually protect him and identify him so that others would know that if they were to do something to him, that there would be a repercussion for that, right? But people get confused and they say, oh, the curse was the skin color. No, the curse wasn't that. The curse was not being able to hold the priesthood and gain the blessings
Which
that
was
came
just
with it.
brought up to me by, again, my friend, who I put a video out of him,
Mhm.
me and him. I haven't put that one out yet. I
Yeah.
put the first half, but we go into that idea, and I just learned that from him and didn't
Yeah.
realize it. But do you think that that skin of blackness in the Book of Mormon becomes? I know that we try to swim around and try to what would you say, PC it.
Hmm.
But do you think because of what happened in the story of Cain and how he was hands off kind of thing,
Yeah.
that God could have uh, the skin color of the Lamanites were done in the same idea that they would
Yeah. I think
understand there's a
I think
hands
there's
off kind of thing?
yeah, I look at it two different ways. The first one would be that more of a literal translation. Certainly, the Lord tells Nephi to leave his brethren, right, and to move on. They get to a point where they can no longer cohabitate, right? I mean, how many times have Laman and Lemuel tried to essentially kill their brother? And it comes to a point where obviously they've had enough opportunities and they're not going to ever change. And so the Lord basically tells Nephi and his people, the believers, go. Okay. And so they go to the north and they basically separate themselves. And it's at about that time that that distinction occurs, right? But there's also, you know, a number of verses, and I'd have to look them up, where it's very clear too that they became a loathsome and I don't know if the word that's used is dark, but it may be, people. And that's because of their own doings, right? They became involved in very dark works. And so that's more of a symbolic thing. It's not
There's a
necessarily
countenance there's a
right.
countenance of light and there's a countenance of darkness too
Exactly.
that
Right.
goes along with that.
Yeah.
Even though that we can say that okay, the Lamanites were their skin was turned dark, okay, fine,
Hmm.
but they lost that countenance of light because light comes from every believing, God-fearing person in the world, no matter what the skin tone looks like.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And so I think it's both. To answer your question, I think there is definitely a physical
Literal.
mark, but I think it's also a spiritual reference to their darkness in terms of their works, which then later goes away, right? Because when the at the time of Christ's
Well,
arrival to the
actually,
Nephites,
it's the sons of Ammon or Ammon and his people who start to bring the Lamanites into the light.
yeah,
I think that's
yeah, no,
part
absolutely.
of that.
There,
Yeah, that
yeah,
transition.
yeah, definitely you have many Lamanites that become converted to the Lord. And so
Yeah,
you could say, well, I don't know if their skin was darker, I don't know that it would have changed, but definitely their works changed and they would
yeah,
have become more fair. And the
right.
word fair is used as in lighter, but spiritual lightness, right? Unto the
Yeah,
Lord. And so obviously they separate themselves physically. They also, become very, very distinctive in terms of obeying the Lord to the point where I mean, I think the Ammonites became at times even more righteous than the Nephites themselves, right? So I think it's both, but definitely there is a time when the Lord comes, when Christ comes to the Nephites, where the righteous all come together and they become a very fair, again,
yeah.
spiritually people. And it tells us there that there were no more ites, right? There was no more differences, and they were all children of God and all considered the same.
Yeah. Here's an interesting concept. Now we haven't uh, Samuel the Lamanite. He comes out of nowhere.
Hmm.
Now it's my theory that he's actually an Ammonite
Could be, yeah, yeah,
because they were still a righteous people. They didn't, So I
yeah,
think that that could hold water a little bit. That he does come from that